in every authoritarian regime, officials go along with the ruler because that's the path of least resistance, right? If you oppose him, or if you contradict him, then you face losing your job, so you go along. That is the story of autocracies. But if there were a price to pay for going along, meaning, for example, your child, your children, your wife could lose their visas to the UK, to France, the US, whatever it may be, then you would think twice, because that would be a personal price for you to pay. And Russian officials may have very few feelings of sort of, common human feelings in general, but they do love their families, and if their families were to be directly disadvantaged by this war in Ukraine, then I think they would think twice.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're talking about the latest on the war in Ukraine, Russia's shadow fleet, and how Vladimir Putin is funding his illegal war. And I'm delighted to be joined by Elisabeth Braw, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council, the columnist at Foreign Policy, and the author of Goodbye Globalisation. Elisabeth, always a pleasure. Welcome back to Frontline.
Always a pleasure, James.
Let's begin with Vladimir Putin's so-called shadow fleet. I know you've written a lot about this. What is it?
It's an incredible armada of merchant vessels, mostly oil tankers, that transport Russian oil in violation of the Western oil price cap. And the way it does it, because you would struggle to transport oil under sanctions. So what you need to do is essentially go outside the official shipping sector. So you use vessels that are not flagged under any respectable country's flag. So it's a lot of vessels traveling under or sailing under the flags of Gabon, of Eswatini, which is former Swaziland, countries like that don't look particularly closely. In fact, don't seem to look very closely at all when they register you. So you have shady or dodgy flags. You also have virtually no insurance, because the global insurance, the standard insurance for shipping, is provided by Western companies. That's just the way it is. And Western companies obviously no longer insure, or they never insure knowingly vessels that violate international sanctions. So they won't insure Russian vessels transporting oil above the oil price cap. And then, in order to further hide their activities, these vessels often turn off their AIS, so they can't be seen. You can still sort of try to track them, but the fact that they turn off their AIS means that they are more likely to appear in places where you don't expect them, which means they are more likely to cause accidents. And on that note, these vessels are often very old. These are essentially retirement age vessels that are sold to shady owners, because nobody wants to be seen as or found out owning vessels that violate international sanctions or Western sanctions. So these vessels are often old, retirement age, essentially rickety old vessels that should have gone to the scrap heap. They are now transporting Russian oil. So what that means is that you have this large and growing armada of vessels that shouldn't be sailing, and are sailing under very risky conditions, uninsured, and as a result of all of this, are likely to cause accidents. And the problem is, if they cause accidents, they're not going to pay. Their owners are not going to pay. We, the countries in whose waters they have accidents, will have to pay and clean up.
And I suppose, crucially, this allows Vladimir Putin to get around Western oil sanctions and continue to fund his war in Ukraine through that.
Indeed, and that's why Russian companies, and Russian officials have gone to such lengths to help make this happen. Russia is not a country that exports a lot of things. It really hasn't transitioned to being a sort of a modern manufacturing economy. It relies on the export of energy, and if you can't export oil, then it would struggle to fund the war in Ukraine. So exporting oil to crude oil to countries willing to buy it is crucial, and this fleet is what makes that happen.
When you say it's a large and growing armada, how large are we talking?
Uh, it is, because it is an illegal fleet. It's very difficult to know exactly how many vessels are involved. But just to give you an idea, before the war in Ukraine, the only countries that used the shadow fleet were essentially North Korea, Venezuela, and Iran, and they used. We were talking dozens of vessels. Oh, and I should have mentioned Latin American drug cartels. But we were talking dozens of vessels, maybe around up to 200. Now we are talking about a figure above 1,000. It's as I said, very difficult to keep proper track of them, and more join, and some are taken out of service simply because they fall apart. But nevertheless, we're talking about several hundred, and most estimates now say it's over 1,000. And the global shipping fleet is not that big. It's several thousand. So if you have about more than 1,000 vessels, or even just several hundred sailing, essentially, yeah, they are in the water, but officially they don't exist. That creates significant risks to the operations of global shipping.
It's interesting you mentioned that Iran and North Korea and South American drug cartels have used similar tactics in the past. So in a sense, this isn't new from Russia. It might be the first time they've really deployed their own shadow fleet, but it's something other pariah states and criminal gangs have used before.
It is something that pariah states do, because no pariah state will say, "Oh, the West or the global community, the international community imposed sanctions on us. Suppose we have to live with that then, because we have to pay the price for having been naughty." Instead, they say, "How can we get around these sanctions?" And this is one of the ways they do it. Now, the difference between Iran and Venezuela and North Korea on one hand, and Russia on the other hand, is that the first three are relatively small economies, and relatively, I shouldn't say small countries, because Iran is a large and powerful country, but nevertheless, economically speaking, it's not that significant. But now you have a leading global power, and one has a member that is a member of the UN Security Council, and that has a significant economy. Russia was until recently a member of the G8, and here you have it essentially crossing over to the other side of operating in the shadows in violation of international rules. And that's what makes this so significant. And James, I think the other thing to bear in mind is that other countries will say, well, hang on, we can do as we like. It doesn't matter if countries impose sanctions on us, because look, Russia is using the shadow fleet and is doing quite well, so we can do that too.
Well, that's a really good point, and it does raise the question of, whether Western sanctions, as they are currently constituted, are effective or not. I suppose one of the other key questions is who is buying this oil from Russia?
That's right. What you need as Russia to keep your economy going is the fleet to transport the oil. But you also need buyers, because otherwise those vessels would be going nowhere. And the three largest buyers are China, India, and Turkey. And that sort of raises important questions about China's commitment to the rule of law and the United Nations Charter, but the same thing for India, the same thing for Turkey, and there are other countries as well. And I think this is a difficult conversation that needs to happen. And these countries will say for sure, and are already saying, we can do as we like. We are not part of the Western sanctions. We can buy oil from whomever we like, but indirectly, or rather directly, they are funding the war in Ukraine by doing so. And they can say, oh, we don't have to obey Western sanctions, and we get to choose with whom we trade and how we trade. But this money is going into the Russian treasury accounts, and then that money is used for the war in Ukraine.
Is there anything the West could do to clamp down on Russia's shadow fleet? Is there anything more we could do to make it difficult for the shadow fleet to operate effectively?
It is a massive dilemma, because vessels under international maritime rules have the right to sail wherever they like. It's called the right of innocent passage. They can sail wherever they like, and that is the basis on which global shipping work. You can't just ban various vessels from various waters, then global shipping would be no more, and modern economies would collapse. So that right of innocent passage, it is sacrosanct to global shipping. But what do you do when vessels and ship owners violate it? And I think this is a question I struggle with every day. What can we do? Because every day, more and more vessels, shadow vessels, travel through Western waters and other innocent countries' waters and risk causing accidents there. And of course, by transporting oil, keep funding the war in Ukraine. So there are no easy answers. Every answer that would have been easy has already been tried, and there is really very little we can do. I think one thing, even though it may be small, but one thing that could be done is many of these vessels, a large percentage of these vessels, travel from Russian Baltic seaports out to onto their global journey, which means they travel through Danish waters, so either the Great Belt or the strait between Sweden and Denmark. And Denmark and Sweden doesn't have the right to ban them because they under international maritime rules, they have the right of innocent passage. They have the right to sail through that. But what Denmark and potentially Sweden could do is to inspect many more of them to see, are the vessels seaworthy? Do they have the insurance? And the problem with that is that it would consume so much time on the Coast Guard side, and then just conducting the inspections and then investigating. So the Swedish Coast Guard and the Danish Navy, which has Coast Guard functions, they would do little else than inspecting these vessels, and they have other jobs to do. But I think that is one and potentially the most viable option. And then I think in particular when it comes to India, which is a country that is trying to do more with the West and is not completely supportive of Russia. I think the case to be made there is that India itself, by buying this oil, risks having oil spills in its waters and indeed in its ports, and that is not would clearly not be beneficial to India.
I was going to ask you about India because of those three countries you mentioned who are the big buyers of the oil from the Russian shadow fleet: China, Turkey, India. You're right. It does feel like India is the nation with the closest ties to the West, who could be put under a bit of diplomatic pressure, could be persuaded, coerced, however you want to put it, into breaking off those ties. Do you see any sign of that happening? Obviously, we've just had an election in India. Narendra Modi's back, but not with as big a majority as he thought he might. So his position maybe isn't as strong as he thought it would be at this stage. Do you see any sign of that of India changing position?
Not yet, and I think India wouldn't change position as a result of Western pressure. In fact, Western pressure would cause India to dig in its heels and say, who are you to tell us what to do? But I think by highlighting the risk of environmental damage in Indian waters, that it is a case that global institutions, that, for example, the International Maritime Organization, international environmental groups, could make, so that as a way of highlighting that it's in India's interest to try to limit this trade, and then one could also, I think, work more closely with India to help them find other sources of oil, because clearly they want this oil, otherwise they wouldn't be importing it. And I think on top of that, one more avenue that can be pursued is for environmental organizations, Greenpeace and the like, to step in and monitor and draw attention to this trade more, not just as it relates to India, but as it relates to the entire shadow fleet and wherever it goes. Because when Western governments talk about the shadow fleet, then it sounds like it's just a Western concern. No, it's a global concern. It's a concern for everybody who cares about the health of our oceans, including the animals living in our oceans. So we've seen already in the Baltic Sea, Greenpeace has started paying attention to the shadow fleet, and I think around the world this is a course that environmental organizations should pick up, because this is such a disaster. In fact, multiple disasters waiting to happen.
And one of the key questions it raises, surely, is whether the sanctions that we've currently imposed on Russia are the appropriate sanctions. I was speaking on Frontline only the other week to the historian Owen Matthews, who's the Spectator's Russia correspondent. He was making the argument that the problem with the oil price cap is that essentially all you are doing is capping Russian profits, but also, as you've described, they can get around it using the shadow fleet. And that the only way to really hit Russian oil exports and to hit Vladimir Putin's pocket is to ramp up oil production in, for example, the US and drive down the global price of oil. Do you think that would work?
Well, it's always, I think, easy to criticize Western sanctions and say they don't work. It's better to have these sanctions than to have no sanctions. But unfortunately, what globalization has done is to make other countries as economically powerful as Western countries are. And this is, I think, the big dilemma we face, that if the West imposes sanctions, there are other countries that are willing to increase trade with the sanctioned countries. So if during the Cold War, if West imposed sanctions, there wasn't really anybody else you could trade with, and you were really, out in the cold. Today, you can trade more with India, you can trade more with China, you can trade more with countries in the Gulf, and these are phenomenally wealthy countries. So globalization has meant that you can. That Western sanctions can be undercut, and that makes them inherently far less powerful than they could be. So, what could be done when it comes to Russian oil? Well, I would say, as somebody who feels strongly about climate change, the first thing that should happen is that we should reduce global dependence on fossil fuels, but that's not going to happen tomorrow. So short of that, yes, providing or generating more energy for these countries to import would be a partial answer.
Is it also, do we have to evolve how we approach the issue of sanctions and see it less as how can we hurt Russia and more how can we help Ukraine, particularly speaking in the context of the war? I mean, it's interesting now that, there's a fresh wave of sanctions where the West is going to seize frozen Russian assets and use them to fund support for Ukraine, both in humanitarian and in military terms. Is that the direction of travel here, do you think?
Yes, it looks like that will continue to it's an avenue that will continue to be explored, and where we've seen actually a lot of developments recently, where Western governments have gone from saying there is no way we can use frozen Russian assets essentially we can't seize them. That would be illegal. But now they have found a sort of a compromise where they can use interest generated from those frozen Russian assets to help fund Ukraine, and that is, I think, a very constructive solution. But one area where I think we could do more is visas for Russian officials. Now, Russian officials are essentially all they are all sanctioned now, but all of them have families, and many of those families have. In many of those families, there are people living in our Western countries, and these family members often own property in our Western countries as well, and especially in the UK. And traditionally, Western governments have said, well, we don't punish the children for the sins of their fathers. But I think if you are a grown child of a Russian official living in the UK, and you're seeing what's happening in Ukraine, then you should either speak out, or otherwise you should be on the list of people who can be sanctioned, meaning lose their visas to the UK and the right to own property in the UK that goes with it. There is, and I think it's an area that can be explored. Not, we shouldn't cancel every visa, but selectively and without sort of saying who is likely to lose their visas. We can just say, every family member of an official in the Russian government risks losing their visa for as long as this war continues. And that would really hurt those in charge in Russia. They may not care about the people of Russia, but they do care about their families, just as we all care about our families.
I mean, that is fascinating. Do you think that's the most effective way of destabilizing the Putin regime as well? Because if you target those in positions of influence around the Kremlin, if their lives are made uncomfortable and they look at the root cause, which is the man at the top pursuing this illegal war that's triggered all of this, does that then destabilize his position?
I believe it would. So, in every authoritarian regime, officials go along with the ruler because that's the path of least resistance, right? If you oppose him, or if you contradict him, then you face losing your job, so you go along. That is the story of autocracies. But if there were a price to pay for going along, meaning, for example, your child, your children, your wife could lose their visas to the UK, to France, the US, whatever it may be, then you would think twice, because there would be a personal price for you to pay, and Russian officials may have very few feelings of sort of, common human feelings in general, but they do love their families, and if their families were to be directly disadvantaged by this war in Ukraine, then I think they would think twice. And we should remember, they themselves are already sanctioned, and they knew they would be sanctioned, and they are happy to take that into account. But if they see their children, who are living such enjoyable lives in the UK, face the risk of having to leave the UK, then I think they would think twice.
Elisabeth Braw, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us today on Frontline.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching Frontline for Times Radio. For more on global security and the war in Ukraine, you can listen to Times Radio, take out a digital subscription to the Times, and click subscribe on our YouTube channel.